You've been doing it for years, meditating, journaling, reading the right books, listening to the right teachers, going on retreats, downloading the apps, building the morning routine. And somewhere, deep in the back of your chest, if you're honest, there's a question you don't say out loud. Why doesn't it feel like enough? Not because you're doing it wrong, not because you need a better method, but because of something much more unsettling. Something that a monk named Bodhidharma figured out 1,500 years ago, sitting alone in a cave, staring at a wall. And what he found wasn't a new technique. It was the realization that the very act of trying, the seeking, the striving, the self-improvement, might be the thing standing between you and what you're looking for. Stay with that, because by the end of this video, the way you think about practice, about growth, about who you're trying to become, is going to be different. Not in a way you can explain to someone else, in the quiet way, the kind that changes how you walk to your kitchen in the morning. Let me tell you about a man who traveled thousands of miles to share a truth, and then refused to explain it. Bodhidharma was an Indian monk who arrived in China somewhere around the 5th or 6th century. The Emperor Wu of Liang, a powerful ruler who had funded hundreds of temples, sponsored thousands of monks, and commissioned the copying of countless Buddhist scriptures, requested an audience with him. The emperor was proud. He had done so much. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted someone to confirm what he already suspected, that all this effort, all this giving, all this religious practice must have earned him something. Some merit, some special standing, some proximity to the sacred. So he asked Bodhidharma directly, "What merit have I accumulated through all my good works?" And Bodhidharma looked at him, this emperor surrounded by every symbol of devotion, and said, "None whatsoever." The room went cold. The emperor tried again. "Then what is the most sacred teaching?" "Vast emptiness," said Bodhidharma. "Nothing sacred." Now the emperor was confused and maybe a little insulted. He asked a final question. "Who is this standing before me?" And Bodhidharma said, "I don't know." Then he left. He walked to a mountain called Shaoxi, found a cave, and sat facing the wall for 9 years. Here's the thing most people miss about that story. The emperor wasn't a bad person. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't spiritually naive. He had genuinely given enormous resources to the welfare of others. But he'd been keeping score. And Bodhidharma recognized something in that scorecard. Something hidden inside all that generous activity. A quiet, persistent assumption. I am not yet enough. But if I do more, I will be. That assumption is so deeply embedded in how we live that most of us don't even notice it running in the background. Think about your own life for a moment. Not the spiritual version of it, the ordinary, modern version. The LinkedIn profile you keep refining. The habit tracker you pick back up every January. The way you subtly calculate whether you've been good enough this week. Good enough to rest. Good enough to enjoy yourself. Good enough to stop pushing. You've been doing what the emperor did, and there's nothing wrong with you for doing it. It's just that Bodhidharma is about to pull the rug out from under all of it. After 9 years of sitting, Bodhidharma gave a teaching. Not a lecture, not a curriculum. A single, concentrated transmission of understanding that became known as the Bloodstream Sermon. And its central claim is this: awakening is not something you arrive at. It is not a destination. It is not a reward at the end of a long road of effort. It is not the thing you'll finally feel once your meditation is consistent enough, your mind is quiet enough, your life is clean enough. It is the recognition, simple, immediate, available right now, of what you already are. He called it your original nature, your pure awareness, the knowing that is already happening before thought labels it, before memory claims it, before the self organizes it into a story. And here's where most people get confused, and where the first plot twist arrives. Because if awakening is already here, if pure awareness is already functioning, already complete, then what is practice for? Why sit? Why meditate? Why do anything? This is the question that trips up thousands of sincere practitioners. Because if you take Bodhidharma's words at face value and stop practicing, you drift. The habits that obscure awareness keep running, unchecked. But if you practice to get somewhere, you've already made the fundamental mistake. You've already agreed with the premise that something is missing. So what is practice actually for? Bodhidharma's answer is strange, and it doesn't comfort you. Practice, he said, exists to show you how effort itself became the obstruction. Let me put this in terms you might recognize. You've probably had moments, maybe brief, maybe rare, where something just clicked. Where you weren't trying to relax, you just were relaxed. Where you weren't trying to be present, you just were present. A walk you took when you weren't thinking about the walk. A conversation so absorbing that the self-conscious part of you went completely quiet. In those moments, nothing was added. No method worked. No technique arrived. No destination was reached. Something simply stopped. And in the stopping, there was a clarity that all the effort hadn't produced. That's not an accident. That's the mechanism. What stopped was the interference. Here's where Bodhidharma gets uncomfortable to listen to. He said the problem isn't impurity. The problem isn't bad thoughts or undisciplined emotions or a cluttered mind. The problem is constant interference. And the cruelest part? The interference doesn't feel like interference. It feels like responsibility. It feels like growth. It feels like spiritual seriousness. It feels like trying harder. Think about what happens when you sit down to meditate with the goal of calming your mind. The moment you sit down with that goal, part of your attention becomes a monitor, watching whether it's working, measuring how calm you currently are, comparing this session to yesterday's session, strategizing about how to get deeper. You are now managing an experience instead of having one, and the managing is itself the noise. This is the loop that Bodhidharma was pointing at. The moment you decide awareness needs improving, you've left awareness. You've entered a project, and projects require a manager. And the manager, the self that is constantly adjusting, correcting, evaluating, is precisely what you are trying to see through. Now bring this into your daily life, because this isn't just about formal meditation. Look at the way we've turned self-improvement into an industry and identity into a product. We curate our lives on social media not just for vanity, though that's part of it, but because we've come to believe that constructing the right image is a form of becoming. That if we post the right version of ourselves consistently enough, we'll eventually become that version. That the performance will one day catch up with the person. But performance is a form of interference, and the person underneath the performance, the one who knows the difference between what they post and what they actually feel, that person is watching the whole thing with a kind of exhausted longing. What are they longing for? The same thing everyone is longing for: to just be, without needing to be better. So here's where it gets nuanced, and where Bodhidharma's wisdom separates itself from mere passivity. He never said, stop doing anything, stop sitting, stop paying attention, stop caring how you live. He said something more precise. He said practice exists because habits exist. And habits, not sin, not impurity, not weakness, are the actual mechanism of obscuration. The habit of dividing everything into categories. This versus that, sacred versus ordinary, enlightened versus not, successful versus failing, evolved versus stuck. The habit of treating your own awareness as an object to be examined, improved, and eventually displayed. The habit of taking every passing thought and treating it like a directive, something to be followed, resisted, or analyzed. These habits don't require moral failure to form. They form through the simple, relentless process of being a self in a world that rewards self-construction. And they run automatically, like a program executing in the background. Practice, in Bodhidharma's sense, is not adding new software. It is noticing that the old software is running. Each time you sit still and choose not to adjust your experience, not to make it more comfortable, more profound, more anything, you are doing something genuinely radical. You are refusing to interfere. Each time a thought arises and you notice it without being captured by it, without entering its narrative, without following it to its conclusion, you have briefly interrupted one of the deepest habits the mind has. Each time a sensation moves through your body and you feel it without immediately narrating it, without adding, "This means I'm anxious," or "This is because of last Tuesday," you have given the moment room to be what it actually is. This is not passive. It is extraordinarily precise attention. But it looks like doing nothing. And that is exactly why it's so difficult. Here is the second plot twist, the one that Bodhidharma saved for people who thought they'd understood the first one. Trying to be pure creates a new form of impurity. Trying to be calm generates its own tension. Trying to be awakened creates an even greater sense of distance from awakening. This is not wordplay. This is the actual mechanics of consciousness. When you make purity a goal, you create a judge, and the judge is now watching every thought for evidence of contamination. Every moment of irritation becomes a failure. Every desire becomes a problem to be solved. Every ordinary human moment becomes a piece of evidence in the case against yourself. And you are now further from peace than when you started. Not because you failed, but because peace was never something to be manufactured. It was only ever something to be noticed. Take this into a context you know well. Look at the way people perform wellness, not criticizing, observing. Because most of us have done this, or are doing it right now. The person who goes vegan, not just for health, but as a statement of who they are, who then becomes subtly, or not so subtly, distressed when they slip. Not because of the nutrition, but because the identity is cracking. The meditator who checks their streak on the app and feels proud, who then feels ashamed when the streak breaks. Not because they've lost clarity, but because the metric became the point. The person on a journey of healing who, after years of therapy and self-reflection, finds themselves judging people who haven't done the same work, who mistakes their own emotional vocabulary for superiority. These aren't moral failures. They're the natural result of making the self into a project. The project demands progress. Progress demands comparison. Comparison demands a standard. And the standard, however enlightened it sounds, is just another cage wearing different clothes. Bodhidharma saw this 1,500 years ago. He called it trying to be pure, and he said it quietly. This is itself the problem. So what is Bodhidharma actually pointing toward? Not a technique, not an achievement, not a state to arrive at. He called it seeing your nature. And what he meant was deceptively simple. Right now, thoughts are arising in your mind without asking your permission. Emotions are moving through your body without consulting you first. Your heart is beating. Your lungs are breathing. And none of this requires your management. And yet, something knows all of this. Something is aware of the thought before you label it, aware of the sensation before you narrate it, aware of the entire passing show, all of it, without being disturbed by any of it. That awareness does not judge, does not argue, does not try to become better awareness. It simply, already, sees. This is not a special awareness reserved for monks in caves. This is the awareness that is happening right now as you watch this video. The part of you that notices when your attention drifts. The part that knows you're distracted before you've decided to refocus. The part that recognizes confusion, which means it cannot itself be confused. Here's where most people turn away from this teaching, because it's too ordinary. They were hoping for something extraordinary, a light, an opening, a permanent upgrade to the operating system of their experience, a feeling they could describe to someone else, a milestone on the map. But Bodhidharma offered no milestone. He said, seeing your nature does not make you special. It makes you ordinary. You will still feel anger, still feel fatigue, still feel desire and grief and the quiet irritation of a Tuesday that isn't going the way you wanted. None of that gets removed. What changes is subtler. The emotions no longer own the space. They arise, move through, and pass, without the additional layer of commentary, judgment, and resistance that previously turned them into something heavier. Anger burns cleanly, without the story about why you're right to be angry, without the narrative that converts a moment of heat into a week of grievance. Joy comes and goes, without the anxious effort to capture and preserve it. Life moves as it always has, but nothing is held. When seeking ends, and this is the part that most people misunderstand, nothing extraordinary begins. That's what disappoints them. They've heard that awakening changes everything, that the world becomes luminous, that there's a permanent sense of arrival, like crossing a finish line and knowing, finally, that you've made it. But Bodhidharma describes something far less dramatic. He spoke of eating when hungry, sleeping when tired, walking when walking. That's it. Not as a metaphor, not as understatement, as a literal description of what remains when the project of self-improvement finally exhausts itself. Life, unobstructed. The self no longer standing between experience and response like a security checkpoint, demanding that each moment justify itself before being allowed to pass. Think about the quality of your attention when you're not performing, not on social media, not in a meeting, not trying to make a good impression or construct the right image, just cooking something, or driving a familiar road, or sitting outside for 5 minutes where no one is watching. There's a different quality to those moments, not because something special was added, because something ordinary was removed. The monitoring, the calculating, the management of how you're coming across, even to yourself. And in that quiet, something functions very naturally. You respond to what's actually there, instead of to your story about what's there. You speak from where you actually are, instead of from the position you're supposed to occupy. This is what Bodhidharma meant by freedom. Not liberation from the world, liberation from the constant demand that the world be different. There's a moment in the Bloodstream Sermon where the teaching stops moving forward. It turns back. After everything has been said, after practice has been addressed, purification has been addressed, seeking has been addressed, Bodhidharma asks something like this: If nothing needs to be gained and nothing needs to be improved, what remains when even the impulse to practice finally falls quiet? He doesn't answer it directly, because the question is not designed to be answered. It's designed to be entered. When you really sit with that question, not as a philosophical puzzle, but as a lived inquiry, something happens. The mind, used to reaching forward toward the next idea, the next insight, the next improvement, finds nothing to grab. And in that finding nothing, there's a stillness. Not the manufactured stillness of a forced meditation, the natural stillness of a mind that has, for a moment, stopped fighting itself. This is where the teaching most people have spent years seeking is either recognized or completely missed. Because this is not a dramatic moment. It doesn't announce itself. There's no sound, no vision, no feeling of arrival. There is only ordinary awareness, the same awareness that was there before you started seeking, doing what it has always done, seeing, without commentary, without agenda, without the performance of seeking finally over and the stillness rushing in to fill the space. It was already there. It was always already there. The seeking was the only thing that made it invisible. Let's be honest about what this means for ordinary life, because a teaching that doesn't reach into Tuesday morning, into the argument with your partner, the anxious email, the irritation in traffic, is not a teaching. It's just a temporary vacation from your actual life. Bodhidharma's insight does not produce people who float above ordinary experience. It produces people who can finally be in ordinary experience without constantly trying to escape or improve it. The anger doesn't disappear, but when it comes, it is seen immediately for what it is: a movement of energy through the body, carrying a message, lasting its natural duration. It doesn't compound into a narrative of victimhood. It doesn't leak sideways into how you treat people who had nothing to do with it. It arrives, it is known, it passes. The same with anxiety, with loneliness, with the creeping dissatisfaction that visits every honest human life. These are not failures of practice, they are life. And life, seen clearly, without the additional suffering of demanding it be otherwise, is bearable, sometimes beautiful, often simply enough. And here's the quiet revolution that happens when this sinks in. You become less interesting to yourself. Not in a deflating way, in the best possible way. The endless internal commentary, the self-narration, the performance review, the continuous project of evaluating and adjusting who you are, gets quieter. Not because you've conquered it, because you've stopped feeding it your full attention. And as you become less interesting to yourself, other things become more interesting. The person in front of you, the quality of the light through the window, the food you're eating, the actual sound of rain instead of the thought it's raining. This is not enlightenment as a spiritual status. This is just presence. The kind that was always available. The kind you sometimes touched, accidentally, when you weren't trying. Bodhidharma sat in a cave for 9 years staring at a wall. When people ask what he was doing, the standard answer is meditation. But that's not quite right. He wasn't trying to achieve stillness. He wasn't practicing toward an outcome. He wasn't accumulating merit or building a better mind. He was sitting, fully, completely, without adding anything to it. And in that sitting, in the refusal to interfere, to improve, to manage, something became obvious that had been hidden by the interference itself. Not a vision, not a revelation in the dramatic sense, just the recognition of what was already there. Seeing, unobstructed. So here is where this video has to do something unusual. It has to stop trying to give you something. Because everything this teaching points toward, the awareness Bodhidharma kept gesturing at, the recognition that dissolves the sense of fundamental inadequacy, the quiet that is not the absence of noise, but the absence of the demand that noise be absent. None of it can be handed to you through a screen. It can only be pointed toward, and then you have to look. If something moved in you during this video, some small shift, some flicker of recognition, the practice is not to hold on to it, not to screenshot the feeling and carry it forward into the next hour like a trophy. The practice is to let it be what it already is. Because the moment you reach for it, you've left it. This is the paradox Bodhidharma spent his whole life refusing to resolve. Not because he couldn't, but because resolving it would turn it into a philosophy. And philosophy is just another way of standing at a safe distance from the truth. He said something near the end of the sermon that I want to leave you with. Not as a quote to remember, as a direction to look. He said, "Those who see their nature do not seek Buddhahood. They live. Not they have arrived, not they have succeeded, not they have finally become what they were always supposed to be. They live. That's the whole thing. That's all of it." And maybe, just maybe, that word lands differently now than it would have 20 minutes ago. They live. As in, the search ended not in a destination, but in the realization that life, just as it is, was never the obstacle. It was always the answer, wearing the most ordinary disguise imaginable. If you're still waiting for this video to give you something, let that waiting be seen too, gently, without judgment. Because even the waiting is aware of itself. And awareness, noticing awareness, this is not a mystical achievement. This is just what is always already here, waiting for nothing, complete as it is.